What if the most dangerous move in the Middle East is not the one everyone can see on a map, but the one taking shape just beyond the horizon? Because the real story around the Strait of Hormuz is not just about one narrow waterway. It is about how the United States is building a layered pressure ring around the single maritime corridor Iran has spent decades threatening to use as leverage. For years, the Strait of Hormuz has been treated like Iran's ultimate warning to the world. A narrow passage between Iran and Oman, barely wide enough in practical shipping terms to absorb disruption without panic, and yet vital enough that if traffic there is threatened, energy traders, insurers, naval planners, and heads of government all start paying attention at once. In 2024, roughly 20 million barrels per day of oil moved through that strait, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption, and more than one-fifth of global liquefied natural gas trade also passed through it, much of it tied to Qatar. That is why Hormuz is not just a regional flashpoint. It is one of the world's true strategic pressure valves. Source. And that is exactly why the latest American naval posture matters so much. Not because it automatically means war is coming tomorrow, and not because every dramatic headline about carriers near Iran tells the story correctly, but because it reveals how Washington thinks about coercion, deterrence, and control. As of early July 2026, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group and the USS George H. W. Bush Carrier Strike Group were both operating in the Arabian Sea, while the amphibious assault ship USS Boxer was also in the Arabian Sea, and the USS Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group was operating in the Indian Ocean. Around them sat destroyers, cruisers, aircraft, logistics ships, and a wider U.S. Fifth Fleet structure built for maritime security across the Arabian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, North Arabian Sea, Gulf of Aden, and the Red Sea. That is not a photo op. That is a message. Source. But here is where this gets more interesting. The most effective American response to Iranian pressure in Hormuz may not be forcing huge warships directly into the most dangerous part of the choke point at all. It may be the opposite. It may be creating a layered zone of surveillance, strike range, escort capability, and rapid response force outside the narrowest and most vulnerable space, while still keeping that space under constant watch. In other words, Washington does not need to sail recklessly into every threat envelope to prove it can break Iran's leverage. It only needs to show that Iran cannot close, dominate, or politically weaponize the strait without paying a far higher cost than it can tolerate. That matters because Iran's Hormuz strategy has always relied on psychology as much as firepower. Tehran does not need to sink a fleet to cause global shock. It only needs to make shipowners hesitate, make insurers raise premiums, make tanker operators reroute, and make energy markets believe disruption could spread. A few attacks, a few seizures, a few mines, or even the fear of those things can do enormous economic damage. That is how choke points work. They are not powerful because they are wide-open battlefields. They are powerful because tiny disruptions create outsized consequences. When the Strait of Hormuz is tense, the entire world feels narrower. And history backs that up. During the 1980s tanker war, attacks on commercial shipping in the Gulf showed just how vulnerable maritime trade becomes when regional powers decide to target commerce rather than fleets. The lesson was brutal and simple. You do not have to defeat an enemy navy to create strategic panic. You just have to make the route feel unsafe often enough that commerce begins to choke itself. That memory never disappeared from Western naval planning, Gulf Arab security thinking, or Iran's own playbook. Today's crisis may involve newer missiles, drones, satellites, and networked surveillance, but the logic is still recognizable. If one side can make the sea feel uninsurable, it gains leverage far beyond the size of its fleet. Now look at the American answer. The U.S. Fifth Fleet says its mission is to conduct maritime security operations, strengthen partner capabilities, and promote security and stability across roughly 2.5 million square miles of water. That sounds bureaucratic, but in a crisis it translates into something much more concrete. Escort traffic, share surveillance, position warships at key junctions, integrate allies, and make sure no hostile actor gets to unilaterally define what safe passage means. In a place like Hormuz, control is not only about missiles. It is about who can keep the shipping system functioning under pressure. Source. And that is why the current U.S. posture looks less like a single hammer and more like a tightening net. Carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea provide reach without requiring immediate exposure to the narrowest waters. Amphibious ships like Boxer and Tripoli add marines, helicopters, command and control flexibility, and crisis response options. Destroyers extend missile defense, escort power, and strike capability. Maritime patrol aircraft and airborne early warning platforms push the surveillance picture outward. Even littoral combat ships and independently deployed destroyers matter because they can operate in different layers of the regional battle space, while larger ships hold the heavier deterrent role. This is what modern naval pressure looks like when it is designed not just to fight, but to outlast. And endurance may be the most important part of the whole story. Spectacular strikes make headlines. Sustained presence changes calculations. Iran can absorb dramatic moments. It has done so before. What becomes harder to absorb is a long, visible, disciplined American posture that keeps the corridor open enough for global commerce to function while steadily reminding Tehran that escalation will not produce the political leverage it expected. If the world keeps shipping, even imperfectly, then the strategic value of Iran's threat begins to erode. The very thing Tehran has advertised for decades as an ace card starts to look less like a weapon and more like a bluff that can be managed. But there is another layer here that makes this more dangerous than it first appears. The United States is not protecting Hormuz because America itself is uniquely dependent on Gulf oil. In fact, EIA notes that in 2024, the United States imported about 0.5 million barrels per day of crude oil and condensate from Persian Gulf countries through the Strait, accounting for only about 7% of total U.S. crude and condensate imports and about 2% of U.S. petroleum liquids consumption. So this is not a simple story of America defending its own gas station. It is about the security architecture of the global economy, and about whether a regional power gets to dictate access to an international choke point through intimidation. Source that distinction is critical for an American audience, because it explains why Washington will commit enormous military attention to a place that is geographically far away and yet economically central. If Hormuz is disrupted, the first-order effects hit Asia hardest. EIA estimates that in 2024, 84% of crude oil and condensate and 83% of LNG moving through Hormuz went to Asian markets, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea among the biggest destinations. But global markets are connected. A shock there becomes an energy shock everywhere. Insurance spikes everywhere. Political pressure spreads everywhere. That is why even countries that do not import massive volumes directly through Hormuz still care deeply about keeping it open. Source. So if this crisis deepens, what would the real contest be? Not a Hollywood-style carrier duel. Not some single decisive naval battle where one side instantly wins control of the sea. It would be a contest of persistence, perception, and layered coercion. Iran would try to prove that it can still impose unacceptable costs through harassment, seizure, drone strikes, missile threats, proxies, or mining. The United States and its partners would try to prove the opposite, that they can keep shipping moving, keep allies aligned, and keep escalation expensive for Iran without stumbling into a larger regional war. That is where the current American force mix starts to make sense. The carriers are not just floating airfields. They are mobile political instruments. They say Washington can surge air power without depending entirely on host nation basing. They say retaliation can come from multiple directions. They say any attack on commercial traffic could trigger not just local escort action, but broader military consequences. Amphibious ready groups add another kind of pressure, because Marines aboard assault ships are not there merely for symbolism. They represent boarding capability, evacuation support, special operations integration, and contingency options short of an invasion, but well above passive observation. And yet, for all that power, the danger is real. Hormuz does not need a full-scale war to become a disaster. One damaged tanker, one mine strike, one boarding gone wrong, one missile that lands where a commander did not expect, and suddenly markets move, capitals panic, and both sides are under pressure to respond. This is why maritime crises are so deceptive. They can look quiet right before they turn explosive. Much of naval warfare is long stretches of watchfulness interrupted by moments that change history in minutes. There is also a deeper strategic irony here. For decades, Iran's threat to close Hormuz was meant to deter outside pressure by implying that any serious attack on Iran would trigger global economic pain. But the more often Tehran leans on that threat, the more incentive its rivals have to build systems, coalitions, and military habits specifically designed to neutralize it. Saudi and Emirati pipeline bypass routes already offer some alternative capacity around the strait, though not enough to replace normal flows entirely. EIA estimates about 2.6 million barrels per day of pipeline capacity from Saudi Arabia and the UAE could potentially bypass Hormuz in a disruption. That does not solve the problem, but it does show that the world has not sat still waiting to be held hostage forever. Source. And this is where the long game becomes brutal for Iran. If every crisis pushes more naval coordination, more surveillance integration, more escort practice, more bypass infrastructure, and more political consensus against coercion, then Tehran may be slowly weakening the very leverage it wants to preserve. The threat remains dangerous, of course. A single serious disruption could still shake the world. But leverage is strongest when it is feared and rarely tested. Once it is repeatedly tested, adapted against, and answered with sustained force, some of its mystique fades. None of that means Iran is cornered into immediate surrender. Far from it. Tehran still has tools. Geography favors it. Coastal missile batteries, drones, proxy networks, and asymmetric naval tactics can all create headaches out of proportion to their cost. A superpower can dominate oceans and still struggle in tight, politically sensitive waterways. That is why any confident prediction that one side has already solved the Hormuz problem should be treated carefully. The strait is too narrow, too symbolic, and too economically important to be solved in any permanent sense. But there is a difference between being able to create disruption and being able to translate disruption into strategic success. That is the real question. Can Iran make the cost of American and allied presence so high that Washington or its partners back away? Or has the U.S. now assembled enough distributed power, enough regional reach, and enough international stake in freedom of navigation that the old Hormuz threat no longer delivers the intimidation value it once did? Right now, the evidence points to a contest that is shifting away from shock and towards stamina. 2 U.S. carrier strike groups in the Arabian Sea, amphibious forces positioned for flexibility, a Fifth Fleet mission architecture that spans the critical waters around the Gulf, a maritime choke point that still carries around 1/5 of global oil consumption and 1/5 of LNG trade, and a world that has learned again and again that when Hormuz trembles, everything connected to energy security starts to move with it. Source. So the biggest takeaway is not that the United States has already won some invisible naval chess match. It is that Washington is trying to change the terms of the game. Instead of allowing Iran to define Hormuz as a permanent hostage scenario, the U.S. is building a pressure ring meant to prove that the strait can remain contested without becoming controlled, and threatened without becoming surrendered. That is a huge difference. And if that strategy holds, then the most important shift in this crisis will not be a dramatic explosion on camera. It will be the quiet collapse of a threat that has shaped Middle Eastern strategy for decades. Because in the end, the battle for Hormuz is not just about ships and missiles. It is about credibility. Iran's credibility in threatening the corridor. America's credibility in defending it. The region's credibility in standing with whichever side proves it can actually keep trade moving. And history suggests that once credibility starts to crack, events accelerate fast. That is why the next development in these waters could be anything from another tense standoff, to a market panic, to a broader military confrontation. But one thing is already clear. This is no longer just a story about a narrow strait. It is a story about whether the world's most famous energy choke point still belongs to the side that threatens it, or to the side that can keep it open under pressure. If you want more deep dive analysis on military strategy, naval power, and the real geopolitical battles shaping the world, hit like, subscribe, and stay with the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think America's pressure ring around Hormuz is enough to weaken Iran's leverage? Or are we watching the opening phase of a much bigger confrontation?